Hello, everybody, once again, and today, as you saw in the thumbnail, and hopefully we're heading to the right position on this drawing that I've been working on the past couple of days. And we started it on the 5th of November, and as it's this week is all about, all this month, it was all about fire and fireworks. We started doing a sort of Guy Fawkes thing, but I thought I want to take a little bit of inspiration from the Guy Fawkes and did a V for Vendetta. If you didn't check out the other streams, guys, definitely go and check those out, because in a moment we will be continuing on with the story of V for Vendetta, which is an awesome film, an awesome graphic novel, and I would definitely, guys, worth going checking out and checking out the story and seeing how we actually got to this point, as this is the third installment of the V for Vendetta drawing. And as always, guys, we're going to be colouring it in today. We have already inked it, and this is how we got the detail in the piece that I've got now. So, guys, if you want to sort of see and listen to the story up until now, as in a moment I will be starting that again. But my name is, as always, Blut084, BLUT084, Art and Games, here every day on YouTube. Occasionally on Mixer, and every day and night over on Instagram. So don't forget to go over there, hit the link somewhere down here, and check out what else has been going on, or just put me in the corner, which is round about here, and scroll down and you'll see the last two videos that we did. But that's enough of me waffling on. Let's get that playlist going and get an Instagram post to say that I've gone live. And again, guys, thank you very much for watching this one. If you do enjoy the playlist and you have enjoyed this story, the way I've sort of set this one out, different to the normal streams, because normally I've got a bit comic story on in the background, but this time I've got the author and the creator of V for Vendetta. Again, it's loosely based on Guy Fawkes, but if you had listened to the other playlist, you'll know what I'm talking about. So let's continue on with that and continue on with the artwork today.
Alive, if only for a little while. As for the vast majority of the school kids who died on the spot and whose bodies had just melted together in a rotting, deliquescent mess before they could be identified, they'd just gone.
It is kind of gruesome, guys. Just be aware of that you may, certain things may offend people, and certain younger viewers may be a little bit creeped out and things. So just bear that in mind. So if they just get too bad for you, just turn it down and just watch me draw.
Together as she moved on to memories less raw, yet only a little less painful. My parents became political. A bit of fun, it had seemed to her at the start, standing in the street with her placard-bearing parents, wearing her school uniform and with her hair carefully braided into pigtails, handing out flyers to passing businessmen who usually promptly threw them away, and picking up the discarded leaflets and handing them out again and again. The ones no one paid any attention to, the ones that were headed "Viral Weapons Developed by US Military for Use in the Middle East." That was another thing she hadn't quite understood at the time, but obviously it had meant a lot to her parents. Nobody stood out in the cold and rain and got shouted at, or worse, by passing crop-haired youths, unless they thought it was important. That wasn't fun at all. She hadn't understood the leaflets demanding "Stop the government lies" either. After all, only bad people told lies. And why would anyone vote for bad people? They protested against the war and the reclamation, continued Evie, remembering how she'd been 10 years old at the time. That was when the Americans, after all their apparent successes in the Middle East, creating a desert and calling it peace, Daddy had said, quoting some ancient author she couldn't remember, had finally overreached themselves and were forced to pay the price. Fortunately, by then, successive British governments had got into such hot water with their own electorate for their unthinking support for American military adventures that they'd closed the US bases here and the missiles home, pretty much as the rest of old Europe had some years before. And the NATO alliance being defunct was probably what saved the country when the Taiwan crisis came. Of course, no one had really expected what happened then. when it turned out that the American military hammer failed to smash China apart like the crockery their propaganda machine kept comparing it to. It was the hammer that broke on the porcelain instead, though not without immense loss of life on both sides. And then the hand that wielded the hammer had broken too, and the Second American Civil War had begun, and hadn't finished yet, though both sides seemed to have fought themselves into an exhausted stalemate now. It was one of those situations that cried out for international intervention. But before the war, the Americans had destroyed the United Nations when it wouldn't just roll over and do what they wanted it to. England hadn't been immune to the chaos that had washed over the entire world like a tsunami after the war, with the collapse of international trade, the transnational banking system, and the food supply. With the oil crisis and the petty wars in South America, as the various states struggled for supremacy in the power vacuum left when the United States followed the United Nations into functional oblivion. And perhaps, worst of all, the changes to the global weather system. Evie could still remember how the Thames barrier had burst and flooded most of London. More people had died then than from the St. Mary's virus. But that had been a natural disaster, so no one could make much political capital out of that, except for the religious right. But they saw the hand of God in everything, so everyone regarded them as a joke. And they were, compared to what was coming next. Because then the fascists had won the election and started the Reclamation. That hideous excuse for an orgy of ethnic, political, religious, and moral cleansing in the name of reclaiming England for the English. And it's a
Sorry guys, I was just sending out a post to Instagram, so I'm ready now, and I've got my pencils here. As I couldn't again come out because it's absolutely hammering out down rain, and as I started this, the sun comes out from underneath the clouds, from out underneath the clouds. But hey ho, City and Co, let's go. Got a little bit of brown. I'm going to use my normal pencils, my great big bag of pencils.
And who didn't have the right family values, and who was principled enough not to swallow the party line. When Sattler was appointed High Chancellor, Evie went on, they were at the riot at Leeds. I watched it on the telly thinking I was going to see my parents killed. I remember them arguing at night. Mum wanted to leave the country. Dad refused. He said that if we ran away, they'd win. Win. Like it was a game. And then there was the other memory. The second of the two that she always did her best not to think about, especially at night, especially just before dawn, the one that kept coming back anyway. The worst one, more awful yet than Timmy, the one she'd remembered that very morning when she'd confused it with the soundtrack of The Count of Monte Cristo. She'd been asleep too when that had started. Started with the sound of breaking glass, and the sound of a heavy iron ram battering in the front door, the heavy footsteps of metal-shod boots, the shouting, the gunshot. They should have expected it. It had been happening all across the country and to people they knew as well. But when friends stopped getting in touch, it was far easier to delude yourself that there must be some minor reason for it, other than what you knew in your heart to be true. And always there was the feeling that these things only happened to other people, that it would never happen to us. But then nobody had really expected a fascist government would happen either. It was just after the gunshot, no more than a warning shot as it turned out, that her mother had burst into her bedroom, nightdress clad, and slammed the door behind her. Evie, quick! Desperation, hoping the intruders might not hear. Hide! Under the bed! And she had, though not without her favourite, Teddy, the one she'd always talked to in her troubles, the one who knew the magic word that took them off on dream adventures to a world where everything was lovely, now grabbed one-handed without...
Okay, set myself away. Set myself up here.
Knocking her mother to the floor and revealing not the police they always half expected, but soldiers. Brutal, coarse.
I'll use that for shade, I'll use that later. The Houses of Parliament are kind of like a semi-brownish colour, but not quite brown. It's like a sandy wood stone colour. It's a weird colour.
Evie huddled desperately.
I don't actually have that colour, so I'm going to have to do best approximation.
Managing tiny mouse-like gasps. She looked up in absolute desperation to see her mother
Similar
looking
to that,
straight back
actually.
at her, as if to fix her daughter's image in her mind forever. just before they pulled the shiny black bag down over her head. Then Evie had screamed helplessly, all control completely lost, and the flashlights had stabbed under the bed. And the soldiers had found her and taken her away. I never saw them again, Evie told me, struggling with things she never talked about, and remembering then with pathetic absurdity that she'd never seen Teddy again either. It was like those black bags erased them from the face of the earth. Erased the magic word as well, and all the magic that had ever been in the world. And then there was nothing left but fear. Cold, dark fear that lived somewhere near the bottom of her spine and, at the slightest opportunity, would suddenly rush up and engulf her entire brain and seep throughout her mind. I'm sorry, Evie, V said gently, and with an obvious sympathy that transcended the usual platitudes. No, I'm the one that's sorry, she said, trying to gather herself only to fall prey to another memory of how, at times like these, so near to tears, her mother would always smile and tell her gently to blow your nose and pull yourself together. But ever since she'd said that for the last time, it seemed somehow that nose blowing didn't help. I'm sorry that I'm not a stronger person. I'm sorry I'm not like my parents. I wish I was, but I'm not. I wish I wasn't afraid all the time, but I am. She sucked in a deep breath then, steeling herself to say the word that all this had been leading up to. I know this world is screwed up. Believe me, I know it better than most, which is why I wanted to ask. If there's anything I can do to help me, please, let me know. If you wish, murmured V quietly. If you wish. Another request, meanwhile, had been made at another ministry. This time, one of the civilian and...
What I might do, guys, is move this down ever so slightly. Coffee cup.
How long did
So it's a bit closer so you can actually see it that a bit better.
In snare rods, as Finch's old mum had used to say, which was a stage quite beyond the usual raining cats and dogs, that they got soaked just walking into the building from their parked car. Now they'd been waiting so long, they were almost perfectly dry again. Mind you, it was Saturday morning.
Fortunately, you can't see the extra colour over here, which is annoying. But you will be able to if you come over to Instagram, guys.
And no doubt
and that's not
putting in for time and a half for Saturday work. So
you can't see that at all. Right. Move this up a bit again. Because again, I'm using my Lego made tripod.
As much to make conversation as anything else. Worth a shot. Wondering what it was.
I have a feeling why you can't see that. Give me a second.
One thing is true about all governments.
It is a bit blurry, which I do apologise for.
At last, a door opened on the other side of the room, and the grey-haired, bifocal filing clerk they'd first spoken to, a forgotten age ago.
So it was this colour. I'm going to start with a very loose
carrying a large box
and light shade
the
first.
expression on his face didn't look at all hopeful. It appears that the original electronic records have all been lost, probably during the reclamation, he said apologetically, seeing disappointment slide across the faces of the detectives like curtains closing on the casket at a crematorium. A lot of things went missing back then, but I found this hard copy filed down in the vault. Still with a rather apologetic expression, he handed the box to Finch. Everything we've got on Lark Hill is in there. And then he glanced up, almost in wonder, to see the look of grateful surprise dawning on Finch's lined and world-weary face. Thanks, Finch told him, for once meaning it quite sincerely. This is a big help. Christ, he thought, if only things always turned up like this. Somewhat later, Evie made a discovery of her own. Passing the time until there was something for her to do, and trying to make her bedroom look a little more like home, she found some fabric to hang over the small amount of bare brick wall that was visible between the book piles, and had now turned her attention to cleaning the dressing table mirror. As she scrubbed away the dust that V had allowed to accrue in what was, after all, little more than a storeroom with a spare bed in it, she found a motto carved in Latin on the frame. Peering at it through the gloom that nothing seemed able to dispel, so dark the walls and ceiling were, so dark the books that gathered there before them, she finally managed to pick the words out enough to read them. Vare veri versum vivus vici, she said aloud to herself, though as she did so she noticed V appear in the mirror there beneath the words, and she could only gasp in amazement. For a moment her mind reeled. This was like the old days when she was a child, like the tales in the storybooks her father had read to her, like the times with Teddy. For it seemed to her that she had spoken the magic words, and V had suddenly appeared, genie-like, in the magic mirror. And then she realized that he had really entered the room behind her, and his appearance at that exact moment was just one of those amazing coincidences. Yet such a strange one. By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe, he translated for her, moving forward into the room. She turned to face him. Personal motto? She asked, knowing his penchant for all things related to the letter V. From Faust. Of course, she thought. A magician. Who else would have the magic words? That's about cheating the devil, isn't it? She asked, after a pause to gather her thoughts. Cheating the devil, indeed. It is. A certain warmth in his voice expressed his pleasure at her knowledge. And speaking of the devil, I was wondering if your offer to help still stood. Of course, said Evie, her pulse quickening as she put down the cleaning cloth. It appears that unforeseen circumstances have accelerated my original plan. As a result, I am in need of someone with some theatrical skill. I'll do my best. She smiled, not a little pleased at his appreciation of her talents and the opportunity this presented. I believe you will, V told her, preparing to coach her in her script. Another doctor? Queried Finch, not entirely sure whether he was asking himself, or Dominic, or the empty air, or maybe the rain, which was still battering against the windows. It never used to be like this before the weather collapsed. Now it was weeks of drought, followed by a month's worth of rain in a single weekend. No wonder what water they had was so rigidly controlled. With it falling so heavily, all this would be running off down the sewers and into the Thames before anything useful could be done with it. If the sewers didn't back up again and flood the streets with sewage as they had a couple of months ago. And that hadn't been the first time either. What does a detention facility need with so many doctors? Finch continued, picking up his coffee cup and putting it down in disgust. They'd been here throughout the night, sorting through the tax files, sleeping occasionally in their office chairs, sending out for sandwiches when the canteen closed. And here it was on Sunday morning, and they didn't seem to be getting any further. The latest doctor was a Dana Stanton, one of a list that he couldn't quite remember the length of. The tax records they brought back from the ministry contained plenty of food for thought, even if a lot of it just didn't seem to fit together. Interesting, suggestive, but puzzling. I don't know, Dominic replied to his question, going through a folder of his own. But this is interesting. The highest paid person in the camp was a priest. What? Puzzling wasn't the word anymore. That latest nugget of information seemed just completely incomprehensible. The Reverend Anthony James Lillyman, Dominic told him, seeming as baffled as his superior. He was paid almost 200 grand a month. That is interesting. Finch typed the name Lillyman into his computer search engine. Looks like he was promoted, he added when the information came up on the screen. He's a bishop now, officiating priest at Westminster Abbey. Why on earth would a priest, whose official role at the camp appeared to be to ensure that rules and rights weren't violated, be paid that much? Unless it was some sort of hush money. I guess we're going to confession tomorrow then, smirked Dominic. Yeah, Finch agreed, allowing himself a little smile of satisfaction, as it seemed they were finally starting to get somewhere on this case. And I'll bet his confession will be a lot more interesting than ours. 10. Early Sunday evening in the deanery at Westminster Abbey, now Bishop Lillyman's private living quarters, found two men, one young, the other considerably older, with rather different things on their minds. "Your Grace?" the young man called, his voice somehow retaining a reverent hush while still carrying along the echoing corridor as he sought to catch up with the bishop. A marvelous opportunity for a young priest, he thought this position as personal assistant to the bishop would be, until he'd realized just how personal some of his duties actually were. Still, needs must when the devil drives, even here in God's house at Westminster, and once he'd got used to the notion and some of the perks and side benefits involved, it still was a marvelous opportunity. Just not quite the way he'd thought it was going to be. "Ah, Dennis," the bishop said softly, pausing and turning to look back as the young priest caught up. "Has everything been arranged?" "Yes, Your Grace," said Dennis hurriedly, eager to please as ever. "I've just received your interlink itinerary, and you should arrive in Perth in time to celebrate communion." Lilliman smiled, but it was a smile much more suggestive of reptilian dissent than pleasure, of tested patience rather than fatherly pride in his assistant's accomplishments. The sort of smile that went with his thin, lanky body, with the receding hairline and the almost shriveled skin on a skull face. All he really needed was a forked tongue to complete the look, but Dennis had soon realized that the old hypocrite spoke with one anyway, regardless of what he physically had in his mouth. "You are most diligent, Dennis," he began with a hint of sarcasm. "A noble example for all those who labor in the name of the Lord." "But, Your Grace?" queried Dennis nervously, realizing from the bishop's tone of voice that the conversation was veering toward an area where, today anyway, he didn't really want it to go. "It wasn't labor that I was speaking of," the bishop said, with barely concealed impatience. Surely the boy should have come to understand him by now. And why was he looking so nervous? "It was rather," Lilliman continued, "my final remittance that I was interested in, my last little joy." "I'm sorry, Your Grace," said Dennis, more quietly yet, unable quite to meet the bishop's eye and shuffling closer as if, alone as they were, he was still afraid they might be overheard. "She's arrived, but there was some confusion at the agency, and they've sent a new girl." An inquiring look from the bishop, and here at last was the crux. But it had to be said anyway. "A new girl who, I'm afraid, is a little older than usual." "Older?" Linneman asked, annoyance in his eyes, but still with marvelous control in his perfectly modulated preacher's voice. "Oh dear. Not too old, I trust?" "That is for Your Grace to decide," said Dennis, dropping his gaze deferentially, hoping the explosion he half expected would never come. "Ah, well," the bishop sighed, casting a glance heavenward. "If Job could bear his trials, I suppose I must bear mine."
Sicko, it's going to be a bit sick now, guys, so be prepared for that.
Revealing something quite the opposite of a monk's penitential cell.
Oh, thank you very much, Nikki. Welcome to the stream.
Antique.
Yeah, it's going to get fucking violent in a minute, just to bear with you, just to let you know that what you're listening to is incredibly graphic. Not that I want to hear it.
Images of religion, but icons of the grossest lust. Child pornography. Young girls painted in the roles of whores. Very young. The sort the agency usually supplied, and not just to the bishop, though not to anyone who wasn't somehow associated with the government or the party. An exclusive agency, this. After all, it was run by the government. And there, the picture of innocence in the midst of decadence, blonde hair braided into pigtails, wearing a frilly pink party dress, quite plainly several sizes too small for her, but which she forced herself into.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you like it. I've worked quite a bit on this one. I tried to do a scene.
"Oh my," breathed Lilliman.
Cool, nice one. I'm trying to do a scene in this week. Obviously, as it's Guy Fawkes been and gone.
And looking up, appalled but hardly daring to show it, into the lined and aged face.
Trying to find a nice colour for the fireworks.
Into whose hands she'd fallen. "To think that I doubted your loveliness for an instant," The bishop leered,
Ooh, you know, it
running
probably
his
work
eyes
actually
down
if I
her
got
body from tip to toe,
my
then
pens
back
out.
up again. Not the veal he usually dined upon, but a young and tender lamb nonetheless. Mea culpa, my child. Mea culpa. Thank you, Evie said hesitantly.
Yeah, definitely go back and check out the other ones. Even just to listen to the story and have this in the background, because it's.
Not having to wonder.
I've loved doing this one. I've wanted to do a scene for a while.
As he took her hand and led her over to the bed, sat her down and pumped down by
Sorry,
her
I'm just
side.
going to throw up a minute.
Why don't you let me help you
Sorry,
with
do it
your
again.
dress, my child? He asked immediately.
Keep meaning to
his
go and get
cool
some more
voice
pens,
trembling,
but it's been
his
pissing
eyes
it down with rain
burning
outside.
unsuppressed.
I don't want to go out in the rain.
He started to reach for her shoulders, stooping forward, his stick-like figure closing in like a praying mantis. But she shrank away, pushed his hands aside. For a moment he seemed taken aback. Surely the agency had explained precisely what was required. He paid them well enough after all. Please, Your Grace, Evie said urgently, trying to fight down a sudden attack of nerves. Now was the time to do what she'd been planning, not to get involved in the bishop's disgusting little games. We don't have much time, and I have to tell you something. A confession? Lilliman laughed, annoyance disappearing. Perhaps the girl had initiative enough to make up for her surplus years after all, and she was quite delicious. Pretty in pink and perfectly succulent. I love the confessional game, he told her licorishly, entering into the spirit of things. Tell me your sins. This isn't a game, Your Grace, she told him desperately. Why couldn't he understand? Someone's coming, and I think he means to kill you. There. She'd said it now. Taken the first step along what she hoped would be the path to redemption and escape. Hated herself for doing it and knew it was a betrayal. Felt exactly like the frightened coward she described herself as to be. Knew that the description was absolute truth, and the only lie was that she wanted to do something about it. But if
You
she
can't
could
actually
just
see the
keep her
detail on
head
that. I will
off
give
the
you a
back
zoomed in
bed.
later.
Pardon me, said the bishop in confusion. People in his position just didn't get murdered. Who'd want to kill a man of God? I'm telling you this because I want some kind of protection or amnesty. I had nothing to do with the Old Bailey, and I made a terrible mistake at Jordan Tower, but I think this should balance it out. What on earth are you talking about? My name is Evie Hammond, she said, trying to get the words out before he interrupted again. So much to say, so little time to say it, and then it all spilled out. I've been the prisoner of the terrorist named V for the past several days, and I'm telling you that at any moment he's going to come through that door, because I unlocked the window in the room where your man Dennis told me to get ready. He stared at her then, the whites of his eyes starting to brighten with fear, and she thought, perhaps, the message was at last starting to sink in. He'd surely have heard of V with all that had happened since the Old Bailey, no matter how cloistered his was here. Must have known about the Jordan Tower incident, too. The giant television in one corner of the room couldn't just be there to play the pornographic DVDs stacked up beside it, even if that was its main purpose. And if he was on V's target list, he might be high enough in the scheme of things to have heard about the actual cause of Louis Prothero's death. But then he started to laugh. After all, were there 2 armed security guards outside the main door, provided by the government especially to deal with this current terrorist threat? Wonderful, he chuckled. The child certainly had an inventive talent for this sort of thing. A game I'd never played. What a delightful mind you have. I hope the rest of you is just as interesting. A hand settled on her thigh, his aging skin like parchment, and began to slide up between her legs with a serpentine motion.
Cut it off.
Please.
Cut it off.
Bringing her knees together hurriedly. This was all going terribly wrong. Not at all the way she'd planned it. You have to believe me. Oh, I do. I do, the bishop told her wolfishly, forcing her back down on the bed. Let me show you the firmness of my beliefs. Stop it, she screeched. Get off me. But Lilliman was playing the game to the hilt by now, delighted even more as she began to struggle. Seems like I've captured the dangerous terrorist, he said enthusiastically, pressing down on top of her. Now, how to best procure her confession? Rape was the obvious first answer. And perhaps later, if she seemed amenable, or even if she wasn't, a little carefully administered pain until she was begging for the forgiveness of her previous sins and the opportunity to commit whatever new ones he might have in mind. Yes. He hadn't had one who'd really responded to a good thrashing since that little brown-haired minx in the school uniform a couple of months ago. How could he have felt disappointed earlier? This was going to be absolutely sumptuous. Pushing and twisting, and with completely different ideas in mind, Evie finally managed to get one leg free beneath him, then brought her knee up between his thighs with all the force she could muster. Like cracking eggs. Lilliman screamed, automatically reaching for his crotch with both hands and rolling aside just enough for Evie to get in a right cross to the side of his head, sending him sprawling off the bed and tumbling to the floor. He lay there for a moment, gasping and wheezing, literally spitting blood, and figuratively spitting venom. You little bitch! He squealed, starting to crawl across the floor toward his nightstand. You filthy little whore! Sitting on the bed and massaging her aching knuckles, Evie watched and wondered. She wasn't quite sure why he was crawling away from her like this, but as long as it was away, that was all she wanted right at that moment. But he'd never listened to her now, and somehow the fear that she'd been trying so desperately to escape from had only dropped her into even deeper trouble. And then, with a shriek of breaking wood, the door was kicked in, and there was V, a demon in black, the cloak flapping behind him, the smile forever fixed. Sitting down on the floor, Lilliman's eyes grew wide with terror. Oh my God, she wasn't lying, he groaned, sick with pain and fear.
No, you dirty shit.
It's you!
You wasn't.
V
You're
paused
now
then,
going
struck by
to
the
die.
significance of the words,
Dirty
and looked
robot.
round toward Evie. She began,
It's slow.
getting to her feet and
It
trying
takes
to
your
think of some
balls
word of
off
explanation.
first.
Of anything to express the guilt and shame she now felt, that somehow made her feel even sicker than her terror. The mask tilted, oh so slightly, and by now she'd come to understand the expressions that supposedly inexpressive mask conveyed. Disappointment, understanding, and worst of all, perhaps, forgiveness. I'm sorry, she almost sobbed. I had to. And then the words wouldn't come anymore. All the ways he reminded her of her father came back to haunt her, counterbalanced against the awful, betraying fear. Betraying him, betraying herself. She couldn't speak to him. She couldn't face him. She ran. Evie, he said, looking after her as she fled. But by then she'd bolted from the room and nothing would call her back. Lilliman saw his chance then. The pain in his groin was still insufferable, but the pain of death would be far, far worse, and he found the energy to hurl himself toward the nightstand he'd been crawling over to before, toward the big, gilt-hinged and gold-edged Bible that sat there, closed upon it. A prayer before came was the last thing he had in mind, however. Still doubled up with pain, he managed to flip open the book's ornately inlaid cover and reach into its hollowed-out interior, grabbing the ivory-handled revolver that lay hidden within. The word of God and the power of the gun, the two pillars of the bishop's meteoric rise to success, of his brave faith. If one couldn't take care of this terrorist, the other certainly would. Straightening up at last, he managed to spin round, pulling the trigger even as he did so. 2 shots rang out, cracking open the silence of the evening like hammer blows. But the shots came too late, for he had already leapt toward Lilliman, tiger swift, as soon as he'd realized the man was on the move. He was already within the arc of the bishop's gun hand before the trigger was squeezed, the inky cloak flapping round the pair of them, making it difficult for Lilliman to see anything at all, only to feel V's gloved hand suddenly reaching for his own, grabbing, squeezing, wrenching. And then there was another loud crack. Not gunfire this time, but the dry snapping of bone as V's iron grip broke the priest's wrist, sending him screaming to his knees. A moment, then, as the masked man stood holding the revolver, looking at it contemplatively. "And thus I clothe my naked villainy," he quoted, "with odd old ends stolen forth of holy writ, and seem a saint when most I play the devil." He tossed the gun across the room, far out of reach. Lilliman, a wiry figure still hunched and kneeling, sobbing with pain and clutching his wrist, finally managed to raise his head, looking up at the dark, death-like figure looming above him. "Who are you?" he managed to gasp. "You once said I was the devil incarnate," V reminded him. "Remember that, Bishop? You do remember Larkhill, don't you?" Larkhill. The word almost stopped Lilliman's heart. But he'd hardly done anything there, he'd always told himself, except turn the blind eye that he'd been well paid to turn, and to avail himself for free of the same sort of pleasures he paid for now. It was the others who'd done the experiments, not him, even if he had amused himself at the expense of the victims sometimes. And that was all behind him a long time ago, a shadow in the past, eradicated like the camp itself the night it burned to the ground, long gone. Like the man who'd burned it. Like the man who'd burned it. "Oh, dear God, have mercy," he gasped, realization dawning,
Like
a realization more
it.
sickening than the pain.
And if you've seen the film, you'll know what that piece of wordage
the words
is.
a sentence
And again, guys, it is an old film, but it is a very good film.
Tonight. Outside in the rapidly darkening night, where the rain had thankfully stopped some time before, Evie Hammond was fleeing along the still wet streets as if her life depended on it, trying to get as far away from Westminster as fast as she possibly could. It hadn't worked out at all the way she'd hoped or planned. It had been a bad decision motivated by fear that ended in a bad result. There should have been enough of an alarm raised to scare off V, whom she hadn't really wanted anything terrible to happen to, whatever he might have done, and then it should have been a few hours' interrogation, perhaps a short sentence at the worst, a return to work and normal life. Instead, they'd be hunting her even harder now, undoubtedly blaming her for the bishop's death besides. And yes, although she'd escaped from V, she'd also given up the small amount of protection he provided. But looking back now from her new, even worse situation than before, perhaps that wasn't such a little amount of protection after all. Wrong. Wrong. It had all gone horribly wrong, and now she was even more afraid than she'd ever been before. Terribly frightened that she was going to end up, unseeing, in a black bag. Just keep running, she told herself. But that too brought back horrid memories of that night when she'd been running through the alley, and the fingermen, and V coming to her rescue. But he wouldn't be rescuing her anymore. Not now. Not ever again. A dark shape turning a corner up ahead sent her scrambling into shadow. Not a man this time, but one of the era's huge armored surveillance vehicles, black as night. The incoming fascist government had swiftly realized the symbolic and psychological significance of the color when it came to keeping the population cowed. It sprouted aerials and dishes, directional microphones, and the occasional camera besides, both visual and infrared. And she was sure that was a light machine gun over the black glazed cab on an automatic swivel mount. They didn't used to have those, she knew, but with the way things seemed to be deteriorating, who could tell where they'd end up? Tanks in every street, most likely, and the ever-present whiff of tear gas on the wind, the way it used to be back in the days of the Reclamation. Threatening as a great black killer shark, the truck prowled slowly along the street toward her. And Evie, even though she knew it wasn't curfew yet, and so long as they didn't recognize her, there was no reason why she shouldn't walk the streets, cowered against the wall and prayed. No one inside the truck, however, was paying the slightest attention to anything the cameras showed. They were earmen, after all, and they were paid to listen. And the best listening in the Westminster area, they knew from long experience, was always early Sunday night. "Oh, no," they heard the bishop gasp throatily, breathlessly. "Don't do this, I beg you." "Children's hour at the Abbey," one of the operators said. grinning to his mate who, smirking, fine-tuned the equipment. Any minute now there'd be the girlish giggles, then the warm elfin squeals, and then the little childish gasps that always set their imaginations racing. Snickering, they listened more intently. But it was no young girl's voice they heard next. It was a man's. It was brutal, and it wasn't going to stand for any argument. "Open your mouth and stick out your tongue," commanded V, in a horrid parody of the communion rite. "What the fuck?" exclaimed the chief operator. "I don't want to die," the bishop pleaded frantically in his headphones, that rich, sermonizing voice now reduced to little more than an amphibian croak. And then, as Lilliman started screaming horribly, desperately, and ultimately pathetically, the airman began barking hurriedly into his headset mic. "This is Surveillance 109. We have an emergency." 11. Even though it was only the second time he'd seen it, Eric Finch was already becoming thoroughly fed up with the sight of green and white vomit, now foaming in the puddle of brackish, already coagulating blood that had stained and soaked into the Persian rug. A good old-fashioned shooting at least left the victim with more dignity, or the same sort of knifing that had been done to the security guards outside before they'd had a chance to draw their guns or even make a sound. But a dead man was still dead, no matter how he'd been done in, and ex-Bishop Tony Lilliman had been done in very thoroughly indeed. Perhaps he deserved it too, Finch thought wearily, looking round at the paintings on the wall, at the pile of magazines they'd found in the bishop's bedside drawer, at the hardcore DVDs. Little girls. Kiddie porn. The sort of thing that was supposed to have been stamped out when the new order came in, that an ordinary mug in the street could be shot for these days, but which the rich elite could have for the asking, it seemed. Put that together with what he'd seen at Prothero's place, and a sick world started to come into view. A new aristocracy full of decadence and corruption and hypocrisy. And these were the people who were supposed to be guarding the nation's morals. Good, honest Christians to a man. Maybe V was doing the world a favor, taking them out. But now they'd never get the chance to ask Lilliman about that obscenely high salary he'd been getting at Larkhill. On his chest lay a single yellow and salmon rose, just like the one by Louis Prothero. A calling card, then. Obviously some significance there that needed following up. And if they could just get something useful out of the young priest who was, at the moment, giving a preliminary statement to one of the junior officers. Of course, by the time anyone could respond to the airman's emergency message, it had all been long over. But it was a matter of some pride to Finch that he and his coppers had been the first on the scene again. Even so. "He's just ahead of us, isn't he?" Looking down at the rose and the corpse, standing there opposite Finch on the other
Obviously,
side
I'm not
of
finished yet, guys, but there's the Parliament done. I'm not going to do any more. I might do a bit here and there, but generally I think that's pretty much good enough.
"Yes, sir."
Colour-wise, obviously the night sky still needs to be sort of put in. We've done the main sort of shade on the floor, and in a moment we'll be starting on V. He has to obviously be wearing black, all black, apart from the very white face and smiling on the page.
Tucked inside their immaculate suits, up there near the armpits where the shoulder holsters were. No argument, their whole attitude said.
I just got a message. Give me a second. I think that one from Nicky's actually in on the stream today. I'll just check that one quickly.
"Get going. I'll handle him," Finch told Dominic quietly, and looked up with feigned surprise at the newcomer. "Greedy, what are you doing here?" "Several prominent party members have been murdered, Chief Inspector," Greedy told him coldly, barely bothering to glance down at the corpse. After all, the dead bishop wasn't all that different from any other dead party member, and Greedy had personally purged enough of them for corpses to become, to him, a little more than statistics. He hadn't been known as Sutler's Rottweiler for nothing back in the Reclamation. Now everyone called him Creepy Creedy behind his back, though never loud enough for him to hear. Finch couldn't help wondering what his fetish was. After all, If an apparently respectable bishop was into underage...
Nick, if you're watching,
worse.
leave your messages on
Probably
the
something to do with baths full of tarantulas.
leave your message because of that reason. Can you leave your messages
This
on
is no
the
ordinary
stream, please?
situation and requires more than your ordinary attention, Creedy continued arrogantly, as Finch began to bristle. The Chancellor demanded my immediate involvement. A flat statement, delivered in just about as unfriendly a fashion as it was possible to make it. Creedy had no time for the ordinary coppers employed by the nose, for their chief or their methods. What was the point of all that sodding about with detection and evidence and proof in court, when torture and terror, a secret tribunal was so much more effective? The gun and the black bag, that was the way to deal with troublemakers. It's going to be very hard to run an investigation if you're detaining all my witnesses, Finch said sourly, gesturing toward Dennis, but looking Creedy straight in the eye.
I'm going to go flick a light on a second, guys, because it's getting dark in here.
Especially the evil bastard standing there before him. The security of information is paramount, Creedy said flatly, as if it was a line
Let's take a
learned
quick
by
pic
rote. In
for
these volatile
Instagram.
times, mistakes such as
Let's
Jordan
see,
Tower
tell
had no
people
longer
what
been
stage we're at
tolerated.
now.
That was it then.
Hope you are enjoying the story, because,
He
like I
put
said,
one
I
over on Creedy by getting
freaking
his
love
right there
this story.
first, before the finger. Worse, he got here first as well, and now it was payback time. The first thing to be done was to grab the witnesses and make things as difficult for Finch as possible, and after that all the supposed collaboration between their departments would grind to a complete halt. If only the Hammond girl hadn't maced Dominic, Creedy wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. If, in fact, Jordan Tower was indeed an accident, added Creedy with heavy emphasis. What does that mean? Finch asked shortly, suddenly starting to get angry at the obvious, though not quite understood, insinuation in the man's words, despite his best intentions. The terrorist seems to have a rather intimate understanding of our system, Creedy said airily, now looking around the room for the first time, as if Finch's response were hardly worthy of his attention. The Chancellor suspects there may be an informer. Are you saying I'm under surveillance, Mr. Creedy? Finch asked flatly, fed up now with Creedy's game playing and wanting to get to the heart of the matter. At this time, it would behoove you to cease any investigation of matters that have long since passed, Creedy said brutally, and concentrate on the concerns of the present. Ah, there it was then. The annoyance about Jordan Tower was personal, but that wasn't the crux. That had got Creedy's back up, but the real reason he'd arrived was to deliver a message he particularly enjoyed passing on because it gave him a chance to get back at Finch. This wasn't about capturing terrorists. This was a warning. You mean Larkill? Major Wilson is a friend of the High Chancellor, Creedy told him, with just the ghost of a malicious smile. So that was what it meant to be a
I can't think what colour Big Ben's... I know the clock face is actually white, but I can't think of the colour around. I don't know if it's brown or not, or another colour altogether.
His loyalty is not in question, but mine is.
I'll sit myself down again.
Suddenly not liking where this was going. I've been a party member for 27 years, and somehow he hated himself for saying that. It was true, but it rankled, and it wasn't anything he'd normally parade before others. Something he'd felt he'd had to do.
I don't know why it's not
He
showing.
certainly wouldn't be where he was today.
I think it's because I uploaded quite a lot this morning, and when they do that, YouTube sort of gets a bit confused. But yeah, I gathered you were here. On my phone it's saying there's people here, so I don't know why it's not
turning away and barely able to keep
not showing up on the actual stream itself. It will, hopefully, it will show the views, because that's
If I
annoying.
were you, Chief Inspector, and somehow Creedy managed to turn the title into a term of complete contempt, I'd find that terrorist, and I'd find him soon. Just for a moment.
Well, I'm not going to restart it, so
take a step forward.
hopefully it'll work itself out. But
Tripping over the dead bishop in his eagerness
it's showing. I mean, I've
I've
got only this running and the playlist in the
one
background.
small thought made him relax into a shrug instead.
But,
Just a grumpy messenger boy.
right.
Evie? Gasped Gordon Dietrich, opening the front door of his big,
Give you a
old,
zoom in a second.
expensive Bloomsbury home and simply looking at her. standing there in the same pink party
As
dress
B,
she'd been
I'll be
wearing earlier.
put him in a nice
Good
black,
God!
as
I'm sorry, she said nervously,
needs to be.
helplessly.
Big
looking
Ben,
up
like
at
I said,
him
I'm not
with
can't
almost
think
tearful
off the top of my head.
desperation.
Big Ben's
I
actual
didn't know where else to go.
color around the clock face.
That was true to a certain extent, though secretly she had to confess to herself
Nice
that it had always been
fireworks.
part of the plan.
I did
When
put
she
quite a
first
few
suggested
bit of
helping
colour
him
there. Like
in
I
the
said, you
hope
can't
that
really
he'd
see it
take
on
her
the
out
stream,
of
but
the
you will see it on the
as
picture
he'd
I'll
give
take
her the
later.
opportunity to escape. She'd
Hopefully.
always had it in mind to come to Dietrich, as he was the sort of man who had the status and influence to help her. Then, when V had involved her in the plan to assassinate Bishop Linneman, she'd seen a much more obvious opportunity to make a deal with the authorities. But now that that had gone so horribly wrong,
I didn't put a
she
great
had no
deal
alternative
on
but to fall back
detail on
on
the
plan
Parliament
A.
because I just thought I would just
It
get
had
too
taken her
convoluted
nearly
around it
2 hours to get
once I started
but she
inking
hadn't
yesterday.
dared to make her way along Whitehall, which
But I do like the Big Ben.
with all its various ministries,
Like I said at the very
too
beginning, I
well
put a
known
blue,
to
bit of
these
blue,
days,
as
someone
Big
like
Ben
that
does
for
have a
this,
bit of blue
especially when she was so
patch
obviously
between
dressed to catch
the
attention.
spire and the
Instead, she'd come along
face.
Victoria Embankment, down by the Thames,
and
occasionally dodging into the gardens
so
to
you've
avoid
got the
passing
insignia
patrols.
of
Then
the
up
Fingermen
through the
and
streets around
Creedy
Charing Cross
himself.
Station, and so into the maze that was Covent Garden. She had a run
Right.
for her life in Longing, whether the man
You
she
got-
was digging from was a Fingerman, a mugger, or a pervert,
And your
she
phone.
wasn't sure. But she'd shaken him off, and finally she was here.
Like I said, I've got
Now
the
there was still
comments
the big
up.
question that had been tormenting her all
I can't see your
along.
comments, so just keep them coming.
Would he
I know
take
you're
her
still
in?
there, but if you do need to think, I said
Dietrich
leave
scanned
the
streets quickly, seeing no
the
one and nothing except an
whistles
approaching Fedco truck
to
dawdling slowly along the street as if the
I don't
driver
know.
wasn't quite certain of the address he was looking for. Come on, quick, he said then.
I'm
It
enjoying
never
this.
occurred
My
to him
brain
that
is like
Fedco normally delivered
fully on this
Sunday
picture right now.
as he grabbed her wrist and drew her into the warm glow of the front hallway. Come inside before someone sees you.
I'll think about that in a minute.
Moments later, she was sitting on the couch in his living room,
Oh, actually,
still
I
hunched
wonder
up
if
with
nice
tension,
dark blue would work
knees
there
pressed together,
in the
hugging
night
her
sky
very
because
tight to
night
central
isn't
heating,
actually black.
trying not to shiver.
If you look closely,
No,
it's a night. It's a
actually,
very,
that should be
very,
trying not to
very
shiver.
dark shade of
She couldn't stop
blue.
gulping nervously, hoping desperately
Again,
she
it's a
wasn't going to be
reflection
sick,
of the sea
or worse.
or why the sky is
Actually,
blue.
if she could just faint right now, that would be a marvelous relief. Here, drink this, said Dietrich, approaching with 2 large glasses of single malt scotch, one of which he thrust in her direction. Evie drained it summarily in one gulp. Cheers, he added somewhat posthumously, eyebrow raised and rather taken aback.
Stephen Fry is this dude talk. It's the actor who plays this, and he plays it very, very
He
well.
brought the bottle near for a refill, and then the words all spilled out, uncontrolled and faster than either of them expected. I know every cop in the country is looking for me. I know it's horrible of me to come here to put you in this situation. Evie, he tried to interpose gently, but she wasn't to be stopped. If I'm here, you could be in terrible trouble. Evie, listen to me, he said, much louder now, taking her free hand and almost shaking her as he sat down beside her. If the government ever searched my house, you would be the least of my problems. Evie could only look at him in blank incomprehension. What could be worse than what she'd done in the last few days? And thinking only of herself, she completely missed that someone had said something similar to her only a few days previously. You trusted me, he smiled, and she detected a fatherly and, despite his name, very English side to him that she'd never noticed before. It'd be terribly bad manners for me not to trust you. And when she still didn't seem to understand, he took the girl out of her hand gently and raised her to her feet. Come along with me. A few moments later, he'd led her down the stairs to the basement.
This is actually how the first time, once you figure this bit, is the first time I actually realised that Stephen Fry was
wine cellar filled with racks of
from the
dark,
fairer of the
dust-covered
male
bottles.
sex. Does that make any sense?
Obviously, Dietrich's half hour paid the bills,
Not
and for
being
quite a lot more besides.
horrible about it.
Some of the wines here, she guessed, would cost more.
I mean, I
per
knew he
bottle
was an
than she would
eccentric
earn in a month.
man, but he was
But
very
exactly
eccentric.
why he brought her down here, she couldn't figure out at all. I've always said in public that I don't make art, I make fun of it, he said, as if this explained why he was showing her his wine cellar. But the truth is, I love art, and I do whatever I can to protect it. And then he stepped over to a rack by the wall, untwisted one of the old bottles. Slowly, and with a slight electric hum, the entire rack swung away from the wall like a door, leaving a dark space beyond. He ducked down into the opening, reached out for another pull chain, then stepped aside and ushered her into the secret room ahead. And Evie could only stare. There was only one other room she'd ever seen like it, and that was underground too, the Shadow Gallery. This was a smaller version, but it reflected much the same tastes, and definitely the same interest in preserving what was old and valuable, discarded, forgotten, and forbidden. Books, music, paintings, erotica of various persuasions, sculpture, and though there was less of the popular commercial stuff that V obviously treasured so much, row upon row of movies, on video, on disc, and even on original reels. Remembering how she'd enjoyed The Count of Monte Cristo, Evie let her eye run over the movie collection. An amazing jumble, from all times and all parts of the world. Easy Rider, Women in Love, The Golem, Dragon Inn, Woodstock, 1984. And then she looked round toward the far wall. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed, looking up at a large and extremely satirical painting. "That's God Save the Queen. My parents took me to see it when they hung it at Gallery 12. I thought Sutler had it destroyed." And that would hardly have been a surprise, for there was Adam Sutler standing on a balcony and giving something between a fascist salute and a royal wave, with one delicately gloved hand, crowned and bejeweled and dressed like the late Queen Elizabeth II, only with far more décolletage. A painting made before he came to power, when he and his Norse fire rallies were still regarded as a bad joke by large sections of the population. Just how bad a joke only became apparent later, when those same large sections of the population were taken away in the night. They weren't laughing
Disposed of.
or ever again. "He believes he did," Dietrich told her, smiling fondly at one of those little triumphs that still made living, even in a totalitarian state, worthwhile. "It cost more than this house, but no matter how bad I feel, it always cheers me up." Evie turned away, letting her eye wander further round the room, noticing a large and obviously ancient book lying open under a glass case. She stepped closer to look, but found the writing foreign and incomprehensible. Just squiggles. "What's that?" she asked, gesturing toward it as she turned back to face him. "A copy of the Quran. 14th century. Taken by surprise, she inquired, "Are you a Muslim?" "No, I'm in television," he joked, and there weren't any Muslims in television. Weren't any Muslims in Britain anymore. The lucky ones had been deported. "But why would you keep it?" Evie asked, puzzled. "I don't have to be a Muslim to find the images beautiful or its poetry moving." "But is it worth it?" she asked with worried sympathy. "I mean, if they found that here, as I told you," Dietrich said, with a rather rueful smile, "you'd be the least of my worries." A sudden sense of tremendous relief and gratitude overwhelmed her, and without really knowing what she did, or being able to stop herself, she stepped forward and kissed him tenderly on the cheek, something she thought she'd never want to do that night she'd started off to visit him. And now, surrounded by all these treasures, she remembered where she'd heard that similar phrasing before. That too had been back in the Shadow Gallery, and the words had been spoken by V. And now she was starting to get something of that safe, protected feeling that she'd had there. Probably more so, because if there was one thing she was sure of, it was that Gordon Dietrich didn't go round blowing up buildings or murdering people in some sort of vendetta. The only trouble was, she'd betrayed that protection the first time around. Well, she thought determinedly, not again. "Thank you, Gordon," she said, smiling at his slightly bewildered, slightly embarrassed look. "Thank you so much." "It's all right," he told her gently, relieved that at last she was showing signs of relaxing, of letting the tension drain away. "You know, this whole thing started the night he blew up the Old Bailey. she began, wanting to tell him everything, wanting his reassurance that it wasn't her fault, her blame, her guilt. I was on my way here. And then her words trailed off as she noticed what was hanging on the wall behind him, seen there over his shoulder. Gorgeously colored prints of the most explicit homosexual erotica, and displayed so prominently their importance was absolutely obvious. She tried her best not to stare, but Dietrich had noticed anyway, glancing back behind him and then smiling sadly in confirmation. Ah, yes. You see, we're
very
beautiful
eccentric
in our
man.
own way.
And I wouldn't be surprised if this chap
Still not
had
quite comprehending.
actual art of the same
You're
sort in his
wondering why
own.
you would be invited for supper here in the
domicile.
first place. If my appetites were for less conventional fare. Unfortunately, a man in my position
Oh,
is
it's coming down to rain.
expected to entertain young and charming ladies
Oh
like
no,
yourself,
that's hail.
because in this
Which is
world,
worrying
my
me
party
because
quite
we're
really
due a
desired, I would
snowstorm
undoubtedly no longer have a
in the
home,
next couple of weeks.
let alone a
And
television show.
snow doesn't fall in Cornwall.
I'm sorry.
Snow
He
doesn't
said
fall
with
in
genuine
Cornwall
sympathy.
at all. We've got a
Genuine
tropical
concern.
climate, so when it does,
After all,
we're
whose business was
fudged.
it, in the end, what direction his tastes ran in? Surely not that of the government, the church, the judiciary, or least of all, the police. If no harm was done to others, if they were adult and
the
consenting,
people that live in
then
villages. I
whose
live in a
business was
town.
it?
All the
People
bread
like
goes
Gordon
missing from the
Dietrich got
supermarkets,
sent to the camps,
stuff like that.
while elitist reptiles
Everybody
like
panic
Bishop
buys.
Linneman got away scot-free. What kind of
They're all
world were they
stupid.
living in? No need to ask that, really. A society that treated its citizens like that was a
Cornwall
fascist
panics very
society,
quickly.
and there wasn't any other way to describe it. Not as sorry as I am, he said, but the words that might have sounded bitter on the lips of a younger man were nothing more than resigned acceptance on his own. But there must be others, she asked, desperately hoping on his behalf that he wasn't quite so terribly alone as he appeared. He merely shrugged eloquently. Occasionally you read something delightful, he said wistfully, or notice a rather well-designed woman's shoe, and you wonder. But the truth is, after so many years, you begin to lose more than just your appetite. You wear a mask for so long, you forget who you were beneath it. "12. Same basic toxicology as Louis Prothero," said Dr. Delia Savage, pulling the sheet back up to cover the gaunt grimace frozen onto the face of the late Bishop Linneman. "You could get these poisons from any house in London." "Thanks, Delia." In her early 50s, she was a smart, attractive-looking woman, Eric Finch thought, although he had to admit he was prejudiced. She was a friend, after all. Sometimes, a little more. But right now he was talking to her in her official capacity. Chief Medical Officer, pathologist, autopsy specialist for the nose. Running the body back into its chilled morgue drawer cabinet, she asked her next question without looking up at him, almost as if she didn't want to put him on the spot. Or perhaps just feeling that she ought to ask but didn't want to meet his gaze. Maybe even not really wanting to know the answer. "Any leads in finding this guy?" she said, presumably oblivious to the pun, and unaware that the very word guy had its origin in the same Guy Fawkes whose mask V wore. Honestly, nothing yet. Nothing
So I haven't done anything to him, actually.
Finch glanced round the brightly lit,
Shit.
clinically sterile room, where it seemed impossible to ever tell if it was night or day outside. Delia didn't seem to fit in this cold, empty domain of the dead. She was a warm, live human being, round-faced, though occasionally with a slightly weary droop to the corners of her mouth. But somehow she'd ended up here in a room cut off from the real world outside, almost as if she was running away from something or someone. People, relationships. He wasn't sure. Medics helping people recover, he could understand. Forensic pathologists poking about inside the bodies of the deceased, he didn't. "But there is something else you can help me with," he added, reaching into his pocket. "You started as a botanist, didn't you?" And then he pulled out a plastic bag containing the rose found at Westminster, told her he'd her expectantly, his eyes asking what it was.
Hello.
Adelia Savage
Hello, what?
stared as if she'd just seen a survivor.
How do you
of a
mean? Are you still here,
dinosaur
Nicky?
Or the dead come back to life.
What do you mean?
She leaned closer, looked, and started off again. It's a Violet Carson. I thought they were extinct. Violet. The letter V. Well, that went some way to explaining it. He leaves them at the crime scenes, Finch explained, handing it to her. I'd appreciate it if you could take a look at it. Any information could be helpful. Of course. She started to tell him how it was a hybrid, dating back to 1963, and named after a popular actress who used to be in the TV soap opera Coronation Street. Was there anything there?
Freaking praise.
Finch,
Coronation Street.
vaguely remembering the show from when he was a kid. What was the character's name? Ina Sharples, that was it. A blunt, working-class busybody whom he'd always frankly regarded as a bit of an old cow. But she'd been in the show for nearly 20 years and had made herself a household name.
And again, if you're English, you'll know what Coronation Street is.
Unless his man was somehow
and you know how many
culture from back before Reclamation.
years as a child you would have had to watch it
It was
because your
probably
parents
just
used to love
the
watching
letter
it.
V.
Still on now.
His phone rang
Oh,
before he could take the thought.
God, I hate that program.
Pulling it out of his pocket, he just said, "Yes."
Such a,
Dominic was at the other end, and his tone of voice alone made everything sound
nothing
better.
good happens in it. Let's just say
I
that.
just finished going through the file, Inspector. You
It's
better get
a
back
family
here.
show, but it's got lots of
My,
now
God.
things, and
said Finch, staring as the list of names ran down Dominic's computer screen.
people's
as if
lives don't.
descending
Let's just say every
inevitably
Christmas,
into
instead of a nice happy
As
story,
you
that somebody
see,
dies,
they have.
basically.
Beside every name,
And
was the
every
word
soap opera
deceased.
has taken that on board,
He's killed
which is so much
all
fun.
of them? Finch asked. There seeming no other reason why the dates of death should all be so close together, so recent. Maybe one or two could have been natural, but as for the rest, no way. That would have been too much of a coincidence, even in a coincidence-riddled case like this. All but one, Dominic told him, hitting Page down and pointing out Dr. Stanton, Dana. Who's she? Asked Finch, a rising sense of urgency and excitement tinging his voice. If they could just find her, get to the last victim before he did, perhaps even catch him in the act. Because if it was a series of revenge killings and nothing more, and he worked his way through to the end of the list, well, what then? Not sure who she is, Dominic told him. She was clearly one of the people in charge at Larkhill, but after they shut it down, she disappeared for 2 years, until she applied for an overseas visa, which was denied. Running away? Probably, because after that, all record of her seems to stop. She changed her name. Finch drew the obvious conclusion, one that Dominic had already reached. That's what I'm guessing, the young man said. I put in a call to the registry, but I haven't heard back. But it is late after all. Or early. Call him again, Finch said decisively. I want that name. And he sat there, drumming his fingers nervously on the desk top, waiting as Dominic pestered and blustered his way through the usual succession of unhelpful, buck-passing civil servants, until, finally... What? The young detective exclaimed in surprise. Are you sure about that? Okay. Thank you. He hung up, then glanced toward Finch with a look of rather nervous bewilderment. This was news he didn't really want to give him. After all, there were some things his boss couldn't quite keep to himself, even if he'd never mentioned them aloud. Dr. Dana Stanton, Dominic said.
Just checking my Instagram a minute, guys.
Then continued.
Again, it's the same name, different place.
Delia Savage.
If you wish to come over and say hi once I've finished being live,
spat Finch,
and
starting
check
to reach
out
for his own
what else,
phone and then tapping out
I'll be
her
getting up
number.
to, and what else I
just
get
saw
up to.
her. Absolutely nothing. No answer, no ringing tone, just nothing. A cold terror almost paralyzed his fingers as he tried again. Again. Then tried the operator. I'm sorry, Inspector, she said at last. I can't get a response from that number. There's a problem with the connection. Jesus Christ, he's there! Finch slammed down the phone and lurched wearily to his feet, then hurriedly reached for his coat. Let's go. The night was still deep over Plaistow, where a bright moon shone through a gap in the breeze-rippled curtains of Delia Savage's bedroom. Asleep, her face had regained all the peaceful innocence of a child's, or the newly dead. It was an irony she would surely have appreciated as a pathologist, if only she could have seen herself unconscious. But finally she stirred, drew in a sharper breath, and woke. Woke to the scent of roses, and to a dark, cloaked figure in a broad-brimmed hat, standing silently in the shadows, barely visible in the moonlight. "It's you, isn't it?" she asked, sitting up suddenly, but speaking with a calm, quiet voice. "You've come to kill me." "Yes," said the intruder, floating toward her bedside like the angel of death, his calm tone matching her own. The hat tilted back slightly then, revealing the mask in the moonlight. "Thank God," said Delia Savage, and softly began to weep. It was to be a romantic death, then, the sort she'd always hoped for but never dared expect, with moonlight and roses. Not with fury and violence, but with quietness and peace. And V, playing the perfect gentleman, stood there beside her in silence until she gathered herself, until the tears stopped flowing, and finally, until she was prepared to raise her head and look him in the face. Or rather, the mask. The mask that revealed nothing, but eloquently said so much. "After what happened, after what they did," she began falteringly, "I thought about killing myself. But I knew one day you'd come for me." She glanced round then toward the nightstand beside her bed, and the red, leather-bound book that lay there. The book that, on some impulse, she felt the need earlier in the evening to get from the small safe concealed in the bottom of her wardrobe, where it had sat unread for years. Not that she'd wanted to read it again herself, but because she'd known that there'd be someone who would, even if at the time she hadn't been quite certain who. Known as well that this, somehow, would be the night of revelations. And oh, how she wanted the story to be known, to escape from all those years of government suppression and finally be brought to light. It wouldn't even matter to her if it was only shared with one other person, and the story was never made public, but if she could just pass it on to someone and lay down the burden of guilt that she'd been carrying for so many years before she died. "I didn't know what they were going to do," she told him, as if some final confession, or at least an explanation, was necessary for her soul. "I swear I didn't. Read my journal." She glanced toward the book, but if she hoped for some expression of sympathy, it wasn't forthcoming. "What they did," V told her, unmoving, like a judge pronouncing sentence, "was only possible because of you." A cold evaluation that, and hardly the clemency she'd hoped for, but truthful nonetheless. And truth was something to be treasured after so many years of lies. "Oppenheimer was able to change more than the course of a war," she said meditatively, thankful if not for sympathy, at least for the opportunity to talk. "He changed the entire course of human history. Is it wrong to hold on to that kind of hope?" "I haven't come for what you hope to do, Delia," he told her gently, and the use of her new first name seemed almost like forgiveness. Dr. Dana Stanton would have struck her as much more accusatory, would have reminded her so much more of her guilt. "I've come for what you did." "Yes, I know," she sighed, shaking her head wearily. "It's funny. I was given one of your roses today. I wasn't sure you were the terrorist until I saw it." And with that she managed a small, rueful smile. "What a strange coincidence that I should be given it today." "There are no coincidences, Delia," said V softly. "Only the illusion of coincidence." And then he reached into his cloak, pulled out something that seemed to glow palely in moonlight. "I've another rose," he said, handing it to her. "This one is for you." She took it almost gratefully, held it close, and looked at it as if it was the last treasure in her life, and somehow the most valued one of all. A valentine from Death himself, come now to claim her as his long predestined bride. "Are you going to kill me now?" she asked at last, looking up toward him with genuine warmth in her expression. "I killed you 10 minutes ago," he said, showing her an empty syringe, "while you slept." "Is there any pain?" Her doctor's voice now. A last medical inquiry in the spirit of professional curiosity. "No," he said in a tone of obvious, reassuring truthfulness. "Thank you." Outside, on the still night air, a distant police siren began to wail. But if V felt even the slightest touch of concern about that, it was not at all apparent. "Is it meaningless to apologize?" she asked. One last question while there was still time. "Never," he said, and at that the mask seemed touched with something of a real smile. "I'm sorry," she murmured, as the rose slipped slowly from her fingers. And then there was only silence, as an expression of peaceful innocence returned to her face. Less than 2 minutes later, Finch's car screeched to a halt outside, the passenger door opening before it had even stopped. Cursing the amount of time it had taken them to cross East London to get here, even with the curfewed, empty roads and Dominic's dangerous driving, Finch ran toward the house and pressed the doorbell urgently, repeatedly. Waiting no more than 30 seconds for a response, a lush, a sound, anything, he summoned Dominic forward and told him to kick in the front door. They found her in the bedroom, lying at peace in the moonlight, the bedclothes pushed back where she first sat up, her eyes open and staring fixedly at the ceiling, the violet Carson rose lying loosely in her lap. Too late. Too late again. And this, the occasion when Finch had wanted most of all to be on time. "Damn it," he muttered, with mingled anger and despair. He wanted to say much more, of course, to rage and shout and curse the entire world and the God who allowed such things to happen. But somehow he couldn't bring himself to break the serenity that seemed to have fallen over Delia, her room, and all the moonlit night. Almost as if the world itself were telling Delia Savage, "Rest in peace," and he could only add the same, remembering the few times they drifted together, two lonely people in their middle age who'd gone for dinner and wound up once here and twice at his place, before drifting apart again the following morning with vague promises that neither of them ever really intended to keep. That bottle of scotch they drained together, when she told him pathologists had more to get drunk about than coppers ever did, and he told her plainly that they didn't. But even when she couldn't stand up anymore and he'd had to carry her off to bed, she still hadn't mentioned anything about Larkhill. And then his eye lit on the leather-bound journal, still there by the bedside, inviting attention, waiting to be read. There was no way Finch was going to allow this particular piece of evidence to fall into Peter Creedy's hands, and the only way to prevent that happening, and to cover his exposed rear end at the same time, was to take it right to the top himself. So here he was, after a sleepless night's reading, alone in the cabinet room in Downing Street, looking up at the huge monitor dwarfed by the televised face of Adam Sattler. "It was found at the crime scene, beside the bed," Finch explained, gesturing toward the journal on the table before him, knowing that the multi-angle cameras around the room would be picking up a view of it well enough, along with every nuance of Finch's behavior. Difficult to conceal anything when every slightest movement, every trace of expression could be picked up and examined from a multitude of different angles. And every word, every pause, every breath, and every sign.
Okay, I don't know if you can see what I just did there. I feel just a smidge behind shading.
Tell the truth and shame the devil, Finch thought to himself. And that was pretty much how he was seeing the
So I've still got a colour in V there. I'm not sure if I should though, to be honest with you. It kind of looks cool with that, with like an inspectory type thing, but it's not Guy Fawkes, and I don't want it to be looking like Guy Fawkes, as other than it is an incarnation, if that's a word, of Guy himself, as you can hear in the background. V is a venerable. Vendrus.
But he tried to keep all
Vendrus?
those feelings out of his presentation
No, that's not one
as he
word.
told Sattler something of the journal's
Vengeful.
contents. Whether he'd
That's the
succeeded,
word.
well, only time would tell.
You okay?
The terrorist
Quick
obviously
zoom in on
wanted
what
us
I've
to
just
have
done
it,
there.
he continued, looking up at the screen to watch Sattler's reaction to what he said next. He wanted us to know the story.
I think it needed just a little
Or at
bit
least
more,
a part of it.
other than being left
The
to white.
reaction was pretty much as he'd expected. First time he'd ever seen the evil old bastard even remotely discomfited.
And the night sky I also
Like
did.
Paris' little triumph,
Again, I put a blue
mixed in
there
with its larger, far
instead
more
of
widespread
just black,
despairs.
because you've always got black on
Am
the
I
bottom
to
here and the shadow.
understand that you have
and
read the
such?
whole of this document, Inspector? Sattler said coldly, malignance ringing in every word. Yes, sir. Finch had.
And the
And it would have been
detail
obvious
is
that he had,
hinted,
or he wouldn't
but
have known
not
it was important enough to bring to
over-coloured.
Downing
I
Street.
tried to do
There
that
was
on
no point in lying
purpose.
about it. But there was still that gnawing uncertainty in his gut about what the consequences might be. He didn't want to end up in a bag any more than
Where I
anyone
wish you to be.
Has anyone else read it? Sattler continued, trying to sound matter of fact, but somehow just suggesting he was looking for an excuse for further action. What they used to call euphemistically executive action, with the emphasis on
Okay, right.
no, sir. Finch
The
waited. It wasn't as bad
hero
as it
or
could be.
the...
After a few seconds of narrow
What would you call these? Is he really a hero? He kind of is a hero.
Alive or not,
Sort of,
Sattler made his
but
pronouncement.
not.
Then let me make this perfectly clear to you. The contents of this document are a matter of national security, constituting an assault on the character of several important party members, as well as being a blatant violation of the Articles of Allegiance. A pause. And then came the statement of denial that would, true or false, obviously be the official party line. As the authenticity of this document cannot be verified, Sattler continued with heavy emphasis, it could be an elaborate forgery created by the terrorist, as easily as it could be the deranged fantasy of a former party member who resigned for psychological reasons. Any discussion of this document or its contents will be considered at the very least an act of sedition, if not a willful act of treason. Is that understood, Mr. Finch? Yes, sir, he said aloud. Bullshit, he thought in silence. You would do well, Inspector, Sattler said with finality, to put it entirely out of your mind. Finch nodded acquiescence, but the journal, which was obviously going to stay behind when he left, just sat there on the table before him like a bitten apple, refusing to be unbit. And the only thing that would get the contents out of his mind now was a bullet through the brain. 13. May 23rd, the journal had started, as journals do, though it had been quite obvious to Finch that the bare narrative of Delia Surridge's words had only represented the tip of the iceberg, the merest aide-memoire.
I'm telling
The real memories
telling the shade come from here because I'm trying to use that light
could
as
only be
the
conjecture.
light
But
source.
Finch had seen enough
Not only did
after all the times he'd
the
lived through, all the government
sign, but
processes
the
he'd seen,
V.
to imagine them easily enough.
I'm not going to put
And
any
if the world
shading
had seemed to
whatsoever on the
forgive
face. In
Delia
fact, I'm
Surridge on
actually
the
going to
night of her
remove
death,
what's actually on
he had
there.
to say that now, after reading the
Over
narrative of
there.
all the things she'd done and all the other things she'd neglected, he couldn't really understand why. My first batch of subjects arrived today, and I have to admit that I'm very excited. The journal's first entry had begun, and Finch, knowing Delia Surridge personally as he had, was appalled at the ease with which, from the very start, she had been able to slip into thinking of subjects rather than people. People who would, he knew, have arrived at the camp packed into trucks, like cattle, probably without even any room to sit as they
Stretching
rattled along
pencils.
the long deteriorated
We're going
roads.
to bed to shop.
The people you didn't see anymore. Arabs, Africans, Asians, Chinese, gypsies. People who prayed to different gods. Queers and lesbians, political agitators, men, women, and children. But not solid British criminals of Anglo-Saxon origin, of course. Criminals you could always make use of. As concentration camp guards, for example. The kind who would have been laughing as they directed the detainees into steel-barred pens, sorting them by type and sex, like cattle, tearing families apart, taking children from their mothers, and all with a casual violence quite unrecorded in the journal. If Delia Surridge had ever seen it, of course, or if she had the eyes to see. He had to rather doubt it, or at least he'd hoped she hadn't seen it, because if she had, it opened up a side of this woman to view that he'd rather not know. But then she'd been young back then, and the woman he'd known had had plenty of time to repent. And how easily, after all, we compromise ourselves. Who was he to sit in judgment over? He always liked to think of himself as an honest copper, but he was still a party member. And he knew quite well what happened to the people he helped to convict. The country didn't have the financial resources to keep anyone in jail for life, no matter what the official line was. Surprising how many people committed suicide in prison these days. Yes, he thought as he read on.
Get my reference
I
picture
didn't
up,
like
making sure I don't miss anything before I can put the colours in black.
I can't help but wonder if this is how Robert Oppenheimer felt. This could be the dawn of a new age. Nuclear power is meaningless in a world where a virus can kill an entire population and leave its wealth intact. A misguided optimism that overrode all moral concerns, that saw progress in terms of replacing one horror with another that was only better when evaluated in terms of property and wealth. Science for science's sake, and an appeal to her personal deities, even if some held them far more morally questionable than she did. And always that same inhumanity. Or, no, it wasn't inhumanity. It was simply a lack of humanity, the same mindset that was only interested in test results and not the people the tests were carried out on. And mixed in with the victims, they'd been familiar names, names that, all these years later, had become victims in their turn. And certainly, Finch now had to think, more deserving victims than those whose destruction they'd presided over then. May 27th. Commander Prothero toured the lab with a priest, the Reverend Lilliman, who I was told is here to monitor for rules and rights violations. It made me nervous, but afterwards the commander assured me there wouldn't be a problem. I'll bet, Finch had thought. Prothero and Lilliman
Pretty sure it doesn't have buttons.
Exploiting the situation for all
But
they were
he
worth.
does now.
The
I think it
thug
adds
in
something to it.
uniform and the sanctimonious snake. Rules, rights, problems. We make the rules, and they're always right. No problem, is there? Fancy the ones in Block 11, do you, Father? Or is it the 11-year-olds in Block 1? Going to help them pray? Of course you are. Down on your knees, my child, and take the sacrament in your mouth. Oh, yes. Did I tell you about the time I was in Aden with those 2 girls and a monkey? Real corker, that one. Not that Delia would have known anything about that particular evil, being safely immured in the medical research block with her subjects. Though were the insertions she made with her hypodermic syringes really any less vile than the insertions of the priest? June 2nd. I keep wondering whether, if these people knew how they might be helping their country, they would act any differently. Except that it quite plainly wasn't their country anymore. And what chance had they to act any differently anyway?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Delia, what were you thinking? They're so weak and pathetic. They never look you in the eye. I find myself hating them. Probably, Finch thought, because the only alternative to hating them would have been to hate herself. And then the whole thing would have come apart at the seams. The pretense that this was nothing more than medical research, that inspecting the wards of dead-eyed men and women with lesions on their bodies and open sores on their faces was a hospital round, that the failures were properly buried rather than taken up by men in biohazard suits and hosed with chemicals before being thrown into a hole in the ground. A mass grave where all the bodies of those who kept themselves apart in real life, the Muslims, the Jews, the Hindus, and the Christians, could rot into one another indiscriminately in a vast and fetid heap. After all, the overloaded cremation ovens were burnt out long before. August 18th. Of the original 4 dozen, over 75% are now deceased. No controllable pattern has yet emerged. And then there were the last ones. The ones who, amidst the dreadful daily turnover of the general war, had somehow managed to survive the longest, and grown the most interesting cultures, and had been given their own rooms. The ones with Roman numerals on their heavily locked and bolted doors that, being windowless and tiny, were quite plainly the prison cells she could never quite bring herself to call them. And the rooms that, when the occupants died, were locked and given a chalk mark X upon the door and never used again. September 18th. There is one case that continues to give me hope. He exhibits none of the immune system pathologies that the other subjects developed. I've discovered several cellular anomalies in his blood that I have been unable to categorize. The mutations seem to have triggered the abnormal development of basic kinesthesia and reflexes. I suspect this may be due to certain pre-existing elements initially found in his bloodstream. Upon questioning, the subject said he could no longer remember who he was or where he was from. Whoever he was, he is now the key to our dream, and the hope that all of this will not have been in vain. Much of the journal had been routine, but it was quite plain that the longer he survived, the more Delia Surridge had become fascinated with this man in room 5, and the magnetic personality he'd seemed to develop as a result of the experiment, quite apart from his speed of movement. She'd obviously been unable to decide whether he was insane, but had noted down the way that, despite saying little, he'd begun to look at her as if she were some sort of insect, as if she were the object of an experiment that he was carrying out, rather than the other way round. Eventually, his behavior patterns had totally fascinated her, with their semblance of being underscored by some deranged logic that she couldn't quite understand, but always seemed to be on the verge of being able to. More and more often, the journal referred to her having spent a whole day studying the man in room 5, to the neglect of her other, more inhuman duties. Perhaps that was why she persuaded Prothero to allow him special privileges. Only, of course, after she got the tissue samples and cultures she needed from him for the central part of her work, and it had then become a matter of finding out how long he'd survive after what she'd done to him. But once she'd established that he was no longer likely to be infectious, she got the commander's agreement to allow him out of his cell, even to give him a little plot of land for gardening. The man had turned out to have a genius for gardening, and with the food shortages, Prothero had been delighted, but that was mainly because Prothero was taking all the extra vegetables for himself. Perhaps that was also why Prothero had allowed a corner of the garden to be turned over to him for growing roses. Violet Carson roses, and to allow Delia to persuade him that the man in room 5 should be allowed to put in an order for some gardening supplies. And reading what those supplies were, Finch was absolutely certain that would have been the one fact Prothero had ensured was erased from the official records, even before it was decided to erase the records wholesale anyway. But Delia had been oblivious to all that. She'd merely been watching in fascination as the man arranged certain quantities of his chemicals and fertilizers in piles and lines on the floor of his cell, almost as if he were constructing some sort of model of the world, like a tabletop train set without the tracks and engines, but with all the hills and valleys and houses rendered in different colored heaps of powder, all kept separate, of course, and in patterns that she was so busy trying to understand that it never occurred to her what might happen when they were mixed together. November 6th. It started last night, toward midnight. The first explosions tore open the entire medical section. All that work, all my work, gone. Of course, that was what the journal concentrated on, not the explosions, the fires, the people running screaming with their clothes and hair in flame, the panicking guards shooting at everyone and everything, the inmates dying shackled where they were because no one thought of their release before smoke inhalation asphyxiated them. How many died that night? No one knew. No one had counted. Civilian casualties hardly mattered. Not those sort of civilians. But there was the date again. Although the entry was dated the 6th, the events concerned had taken place on the 5th. The 5th of November. And it was obvious that all her work hadn't been lost. The reports had been filed, the knowledge preserved. Whatever it was that Delia Surridge had been working on, and Finch couldn't quite put his finger on that, despite reading the journal with the most careful attention to detail, she'd already succeeded by the time the project and Lark Hill itself was brought to a sudden, fiery end. I was trying to understand how it could have happened when I saw him, the man from room 5. He'd used the things we'd given him to garden with, the chemicals, fertilizers, and ammonia to make the bombs.
Mm-hmm.
I saw him in the midst of the flames. He looked at me. Not with eyes, there were no eyes. But I know he was looking at me because I felt it, and oh, God, what have I done? 14. Evie Hammond woke with a sense of déjà vu, or so she thought at first, though she soon realized that Gordon Dietrich's guest bedroom, with its sumptuously silken bedsheets and marquetry work wardrobes, cloisonné vases, and brocade drapes, now parted to let the sunlight stream through in brilliant golden splendor, was quite outside her experience. Not a sense of seen before, then, smelled before. Uncertain, or more to the point, not quite believing, she began to get an inkling of just what that aroma was, and tumbled out of bed, dressing hurriedly in the clothes that Gordon had fetched for her late the previous night, ringing up a friend with some tale of a long-neglected niece arriving from Carlisle, with nothing more than the clothes she had on at the time, and then risking the curfew to go and borrow an outfit for her. Such good taste he had, too, although now, knowing what she did about him, that wasn't quite such a surprise. Mind you, anything would have been better than the little pink party dress she'd arrived in. And a night's sleep having soothed away the nerves of the previous day somewhat, she had to say that she couldn't really have hoped to find a better place of sanctuary. Still, thoughts like that weren't getting that aroma investigated. She slipped on her shoes and headed downstairs. As expected, she found Dietrich in the kitchen, a frying pan in one hand, a spatula in the other. "Bonjour, mademoiselle," he grinned brightly, becoming aware of her standing hesitantly at the door, then pausing as he noticed the confused look on her face.
Might have to go over that again with a little bit of ink just to sort of differentiate, if that's the word, between the two darkness.
My mum used to make them. Sit down. She did, still looking a little bewildered, and he served the eggs onto a plate before her. Just the same meal. Just the same way. "Is this a dream?" she asked, more to herself than him, though nothing was going to stop her from picking up the knife and fork and making a start. "What do you mean?" Dietrich asked, a little bewildered himself now. "The first morning I was with him, he made me eggs just like this." "Really?" he asked, eyebrows rising in genuine surprise. "I swear," she assured him, not wanting to be laughed at over something that seemed both so minor and somehow so important to her. "That's a pretty strange coincidence," he said thoughtfully, perhaps with slightly exaggerated thoughtfulness. "Although there is an obvious explanation." "There is?" "Yes, Evie," Dietrich said, trying hard to keep a straight face, but not quite succeeding. "I am V. At last you know the truth." Evie could only stare at him uncertainly, not quite sure if he was joking, not even sure, after all she'd been through, if she wanted it to be a joke. "You're stunned, I know," he continued debonairly, finding the straight face harder to keep by the moment. "You wouldn't think it to look at me, but beneath this wrinkled, well-fed exterior lies a dangerous killing machine with a fetish for Fawkesian masks. Vive la Revolution!" "It's not funny, Gordon," she told him flatly, upset enough to forget her eggs for a moment. "I know," he said, deflatingly. "I'm useless without a studio audience. I've seen people go to jail.
I'm going to use my Copic marker pen. I'm going to go around with certain things on that. I mean, it's not get me wrong. The shadow, I think, works well. Let's give you another. Now you can see that. I mean, I think the shadow works well as the effect to sort of keep it as the light. As you can see, the light from here is the light source.
She said shortly. not certain she liked the direction the conversation was taking. Maybe he does, but that doesn't make him.
Well, I'm going to be
any
going
less
around
friendly.
this with this. So
So
just
you
so
think he's
the,
doing the right thing?
underneath sort of
Asked
pops.
Evie.
I'll try it a little
Like
bit. If it doesn't work, I'll go back to my other ink pen I just used a moment ago, which is the actual same ink pen that I used to ink the whole piece. I only ever use one ink pen, as much as I can. If I ever do need to use any other kind of ink or sort of ink base sort of thing, again, these aren't ink based, they're all alcohol based, so I don't know how that's going to react with pencil, but we'll soon find out.
What I think, he said at length, is that V is simply giving them the same thing they have been giving us. What? She asked, now genuinely interested in his reply. A reason to be afraid. As time wore on, and Eric Finch finally managed to get his thoughts into some sort of order, he began to ask himself questions both awkward and unsettling. Questions that had deprived him of sleep just as thoroughly as the events surrounding the deaths of Bishop Lilliman and Delia Surridge. Sitting there at his computer, having intentionally arrived before anyone else, including Dominic, he was going through the online archives of the Times, and everything he read only made him more afraid of the thoughts that were running round inside his head. Bad thoughts, about bad people, and not necessarily the ones it was his job.
He's not going to need much. Looking at
Terrorists strike with biological weapons.
Really not going to need much.
One
But
of
I
the
might
headlines. But that wasn't the only one that
ever so
interested him.
slightly hint
It
it
wasn't the only one this particular
corners.
search had turned up.
Here.
Bleary-eyed and almost afraid of the way all this was starting
Just
to fall into
differentiate
place in
between his
mind,
legs
he
and
began
the
to
actual
relive
cloak
the
itself.
other horrors that had followed that first shocking report from 14 years ago through the ensuing series of headlines. St. Mary's virus kills 178, said another. And he recalled that had included Evie Hammond's brother. 3 waters infected, and tube terror. Then, eloquent in its simplicity, epidemic.
Oh, you
One
can
he
see it on
remembered being
screen,
involved in
really.
personally. 2 of the men under him had been brutally murdered there.
Actually going on quite well. I
Hospital.
like that.
And finally, the worst one of all. More of an epitaph than a headline. 8,000 dead. Even so, he knew, that was just the total for that first outbreak. When you added on the death toll from the other attacks,
I don't want to go overboard with that. It's only a hint.
The final count was something far, far worse than that.
Complete.
It was all starting to add up, and the sum total was, quite simply, horrible. Finch was still reading when Dominic arrived and greeted him with a cheery, "Morning, Inspector. You're at it early." This morning, Finch found Dominic's youthful energy and enthusiasm depressing, but right then he found anything and everything depressing. "Something wrong?" the young man asked, now with genuine concern as he looked at his boss's pasty face. Jesus, the old man wasn't about to have a heart attack, was he? "You don't look so good, sir." Finch shook his head slightly to dispel any fears Dominic might have about his health. Then he reached down into the lower drawer of his desk and pulled out a small
I can now have that, it's really hurting my eyes.
Flicked it on before he said a single word. Dominic reacted in obvious surprise as he recognized the jammer, specifically designed, he knew, to knock out the ears, bugs, and listening devices. No one was supposed to have one of them. That was the sort of thing they
Check out the fast show, guys. Every single time.
"I want to ask you a question, Dominic," Finch began when he was sure the machine had had time enough to warm up and function. "I don't care if you answer me or not, but..." And now Finch nodded toward the device, making it obvious that this was the reason he'd switched it on. "I just want to say this aloud. I need to know that the question won't leave this office." "Yeah, of course, Inspector." But it wasn't a question of Finch trusting him. Yet there still remained the outstanding why. And the why was contained in Dominic's glance toward the machine. "Because of the terrorist?" Dominic asked. "No." "What is it, Chief?" Dominic felt confused enough now that he wanted to sit down. "What's going on?" "The question I want to ask is about St. Mary's," Finch told him in a deadly serious and somehow threateningly quiet tone. "And 3 waters." The names were enough to make Dominic's blood run cold. The question that's kept me up for the last 24 hours, continued Finch slowly, hesitantly, his own blood flowing sluggish with the enormity of it all. The question I have to ask is, what if the worst, most horrifying biological attack in this country's history was not the work of religious extremists? What? Said Dominic, aghast. I don't understand. We know it was. They were caught, they confessed, and they were executed, I know, Finch concluded for him. And that may be what really happened. It was certainly the official story anyway. A band of fundamentalists from the Middle East had got hold of some of the same viral agents that the Americans had been using to win one of their dirty little wars in the same neighborhood. The very same biological weapons that so many British agitators had protested so loudly about until the government had finally been forced to withdraw from the NATO alliance some time before the war. And then, lumping all the Western Christian countries together under the name of the Great Satan, those extremists had formed a cell over here and carried out revenge attacks in London, in Ireland, and elsewhere. And that was what Finch, like everyone else, had always believed. Until now. It was only reading through the news reports again this morning that he realized that the virus they'd been using wasn't the same as any of the ones the Americans had been using. Similar, yes, but actually far more powerful. Something the Yanks would probably have given their right arms for, if only they could have used it in the war with China. But I see this chain of events, these coincidences. Finch picked up his train of thoughts again. And I have to ask, what if that isn't what happened? What if someone else unleashed that virus? What if someone else killed all those people? Would you want to know who it was? Sure, said Dominic, still trying to get his head round the idea that what he'd taken for certainty, for gospel truth for so many years, might be a tissue of lies. Even if it was someone working for this government. Jesus, gasped Dominic slowly, understanding now why Finch had turned on the debugging device. That's my question. His boss summed up.
Should I do any
If our
more?
government was
I
responsible
think
for
I
what
should,
happened
to
at
be
St.
honest,
Mary's,
leaving that as a hint on it instead of a shaded hint, instead of a full darkened figure. I mean, obviously it's thing, but if I was to fully darken that and put that all in like just black, it would not look very nice and very flat and just generally not good. I don't think. What do you think, guys? Let me know in the comments.
The clink of bottle on glass, once and then twice.
I'll give you a zoom in a second.
Handed one of the glasses to
That's final figure, which is
a
V.
look of real pleasure and not.
You can see what I've actually done there. Like I said, I've gone over it again with the Copic marker pen.
And in the couple of weeks that she'd been living with him,
And
Evie had discovered that when he took that
sort of left
mask
a little
off
bit
and became
shade,
his true self, as he
or
only
less
did in
of a
safety
shade
his own
on
home. There was much
this
good
side,
love
obviously,
about
because
Gordon
this is where the light source
even
is.
to love, in a platonic sort of way.
Standing
After
in
all,
the
not only was he gay,
street
he
light.
was old enough to be her father. And that was at the heart of it. With him going out to buy her clothes, sharing his meals with her, even reading her favourite stories late at night.
Oh,
She
you
began to feel as if she
nubdy.
had a home.
Oh, I know what I've
For
just
the
done.
first
You know
time
what
in
I've
more
just done.
years
Look,
than she recalled.
look.
That was more precious to her
should
than
be
she
over
could
here.
possibly express. And he, being part of it, had become
Fudge
precious
cake
to
and
her as
bananas. Right.
father figure or not, he was kind and caring. He made no demands, and except when the pressures of life left him tired and depressed.
So you should always look away from your work and then look back at it, because you
And having her around
that's
the
easily
house
fixed,
seemed to
thank God.
compensate just a little
darken the
for all
surfaces
those
slightly more.
lonely years he had to pass since he too had
Shit.
been driven underground. Couldn't help but
Oh, wait,
notice how
I don't
his
need to.
spirits
I
had
got-
improved since
Okay.
she'd been with him.
Beauty
But at
of
times his sense of
pencil.
humour got so out of hand, she wanted less to treat him like a father than to spank him like a little boy. And in the last few days, it had got worse. He seemed to be always going round with a secretive smirk on his face, as if he were planning some wonderful
Ha-ha.
practical joke, some wizard
That
wheeze
was a slight
that he
darken.
didn't want to tell her about for fear of spoiling the surprise.
Oh, I'm so glad I did that in
She had
pencil.
to confess,
Oh, I'm glad I did that in
just a
pencil.
little bit worried. Now they were sitting on the couch in his living room at 2
Tinted,
minutes to
but
8
it
on
can be
Wednesday
removed.
evening, and she still had no idea why he seemed so happy. but the barely suppressed excitement that radiated from him made her rather suspect she was about to find out.
Okay, right.
What's all this about? Evie asked, as he reached for the remote and turned on the television, cranking up the volume with an excited grin. I'm celebrating, Dietrich told her, clinking their glasses together and taking a sip. The bubbles burst heavily against his palate, matching and then adding to his sense of euphoria. Celebrating what? Asked Evie, still uncertain. She'd never seen him quite like this before, either in the old days at the office or since she'd been staying here with him, and she really wasn't sure what to make of his present mood. But there was something of the gleeful, mischievous schoolboy who'd just got away with a hilarious prank, who'd stepped over the line and didn't care who knew it. Something that reminded her of her father's revolutionary zeal, and of V's, and something of the innocent, gullible fool. This could be the best show we've ever done, he chuckled, as the familiar theme music swelled, the equally familiar night blue and gold titles for Dietrich's half hour appearing with their futurist-style view of Big Ben, Tower Bridge, and other London landmarks, and in one corner of the screen, the BTN logo that made everything official. The hands of Big Ben were set at 8 o'clock, and millions of people across the land would eagerly be tuned in. On the screen, Dietrich appeared from behind the curtains, smiling as he always did, walking out to take the applause of the studio audience. A real studio audience, this one, not like the fake footage and soundtrack they used to have on Prothero's nightly political farce. After all, this was genuine farce, and that was something the authorities considered safe enough to record before a live audience of the happy British public. That always played well. An audience was something Dietrich always played too well besides. Thank you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, the on-screen Dietrich began, again, as always. The next lines, though, were a little different. We've got a really special show tonight. You won't believe it. I'm not sure I do. Would you please give a very warm welcome to our very own Chancellor, Adam Sutler? The audience gasped. And so did Evie, looking round toward Dietrich as if she wasn't sure this was really happening, as if she hoped this wasn't really happening. We threw out the censor-approved script and shot a new one that I wrote this
Oh, I'm glad I did it on pencil. That looks a lot better. That would have bugged me if I left that.
God, was all Evie could think to say, turning her attention back toward the set.
You can see the
he wouldn't do
shadow.
something like that, she hoped desperately.
Government.
That was breaking the one rule that no one at BTN ever broke.
Pun not intended.
When she was at Jordan Tower, she hadn't heard of anyone since before the Reclamation who dared to do that. But if anyone was going to do it, it had to be Gordon. The only question now was, how bad was it going to get? There was a subtler look-alike stepping out from behind the curtain, just as Dietrich had done a few moments earlier, nodding like Mussolini in appreciation of the audience response as the crowd went wild. And then the camera panned away from the Chancellor, out across the cheering audience, before lingering on several heavily armed and, for the most part, heavily overweight and decidedly scruffy-looking soldiers who were aiming their guns at the happy clapping mob, trigger fingers poised while standing beneath a large lit-up applause sign. Christ, Gordon, sputtered Evie, almost spitting champagne out through her nose.
Okay, I'm pretty much there.
She knew that after
Just answering a quick question.
It was only going to get worse.
Talking to somebody, Nikki, on
Back on the TV screen,
Instagram. I'm not sure she's with me. If she is, she likes colour black, and hopefully she will like this black that I've used and the sort of the way I've used it. Hopefully you guys do the too. You have enjoyed this whole 3 days of creating this piece. Again, if you want to hear the full story that you're hearing in the background, go to the very first playlist, very first video on the 5th, and check that one out, because that is where the day began, the week began, and I started doing this piece, and as you can hopefully you can tell, is the Houses of Parliament, with Big Ben in the corner there, and sign from the
feathers, smiles, and high heels.
playlist you're listening to now, which is V for Vendetta. And here is V himself. And I've tried really hard not to sort of shade it too much, put too much black onto it. But I've obviously hinted. Oh crap! Sorry about that, guys. That's my phone.
You enjoy a glass every night, don't you, Chancellor? Dietrich said knowingly. Everything about his tone and body language suggesting he was humouring a senile old fool. Since I was a boy, his foil replied, with smug delight. Smacking his lips before relaxing theatrically, as a couple of the more voluptuous showgirls began massaging his shoulders enthusiastically, leaning forward to display their considerable assets to best advantage. And the Chancellor rolled his eyes exaggeratedly to enjoy the view. But you're wrong, Mr. Dietrich, he said eventually, apparently making a strenuous effort to get his mind back on the subject at hand. The terrorist was never a serious concern. Evie could only watch in growing horror as the camera drew back to show a trap door opening in the studio floor next to Sutler's chair.
Sorry for that sharp sound. That was my son who was ringing me there. You probably heard in the background. He's gone to see his friend. He's just asking permission.
The mask as if to twiddle his mustache in the style of a vaudeville villain. Then,
which is
crawling
really good
the
of him.
legs of the showgirls,
I like it when he asks me permissions because sometimes he'll just go down and go out and not tell me. And now that's why he's got a mobile phone. Anyway, back to what I was saying. This is V for Vendetta. And like I said, I've tried to not put too much shading. I've left a little bit shading as the light source I'm using is here. I only put that in there yesterday. That wasn't in part of the original piece, but I kind of wanted that to be there as the image that I was using to sort of as a reference, that it was there, and it just seemed to have to be there, just to sort of push it off that little bit more. But hopefully you do like this and you like the fireworks. Again, you can't really see the colours where the camera is, but you can see them. Once I'll give you another zoom in a second, guys. But hopefully you have really enjoyed this because I know I have really enjoyed listening to V for Vendetta, and I've really enjoyed as I've been sort of doing this sort of. As I'm listening, it's giving me more and more inspiration. So I may do another piece like this, but in the future, because next week is obviously going to be something a little bit different. Again, I'm going to try and do another scene, but it's going to be more taken away from English culture, more to do with the actual thing from fireworks themselves, because I want to give you a video to do with fireworks, because as it's this week is fire and fireworks, and as V was born from fire and is based on a big thing on the 5th of November, which is Guy Fawkes Night here, and Guy Fawkes is obviously V personified, all the way around. And just sort of try to keep this as it is. But hopefully you have enjoyed today's stream, guys. Thank you very much for watching today, and I will see you next time for some more from the drawing. And I'm thinking about it, but I will be taking this here, digitizing it tomorrow, so keep tuned for that one. Again, my name is Blut084, BLUT084, Art and Games, here every day on YouTube, occasionally on Mixer, and every day and night over on Instagram. Hopefully you have enjoyed it today, guys, as much as me. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell so you don't miss tomorrow's stream. And what else will be coming out this month for fire and fireworks? I'm going to give you a zoom in now.
And now Sutler, on
has
his
a full
feet and
picture.
all his freedom of movement fully
You guys
restored,
get to have a look
stepped
and
forward
have a good old
toward V's
peruse
mask.
as
At last,
all the details
he cried,
that I've
and
put in
now
there.
for all the world to see. But as the mask was ripped away,
And if you want to continue on listening to
both
V for
soldiers
Vendetta
and
playlist,
audience
I
alike,
will continue it
for
tomorrow.
the terrorist turned out to be another Sutler lookalike, And as the soldiers looked
When
on with their
I,
mouths
yeah,
hanging
continue
open
on
comically, he
and
leapt to his
digitize this
feet,
one,
tossed aside the
as
hat, cloak,
I
and
normally
wig,
do.
and revealed himself wearing exactly the
So,
same suit as the
thank you very
first
much, guys, for
impersonator.
watching. I've been
Unhand me,
Bleak084,
I'm your chancellor.
BLUT
The
084,
first sutler
Art
exploded. How dare
and
you?
Games.
I'm the chancellor. Imposter!
Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll see you tomorrow for some more V for Vendetta.
It became quite impossible to tell
Bye
one
for now.
chancellor from the other. All it really needed to complete the humiliating farce was for their pants to fall down, revealing red and white polka dot boxer shorts. But it seemed even Gordon hadn't dared to go that far. Or perhaps he just hadn't thought of it. Finally, they broke apart and leapt to their feet, pointing furiously at each other. And one cried, "Soldiers, that man is the terrorist!"
Ah, still going for some reason.